the borehole that recorded screams from hell. In 1989, a story began circulating through Christian newsletters, evangelical radio programs, and missionary networks claiming that Soviet scientists drilling the Kola Super Deep borehole, a real scientific project that had penetrated deeper into Earth's crust than any previous drilling operation, reaching depths of over 12 kilometers, had broken through into a massive underground cavity, and upon lowering temperature-resistant microphones into the opening, had recorded sounds that could only be described as millions of human voices screaming in agony. The unmistakable sounds of souls suffering in hell. The scientists, according to the story, were atheist communists who didn't believe in God or the afterlife, but the audio they captured was so disturbing, so clearly the screams of the damned, that some of them fled the project in terror, unable to reconcile what they'd heard with their materialist worldview, unable to deny that they had accidentally drilled into the actual underworld, into the biblical hell where condemned souls suffer eternal torment, and that their instruments had recorded proof that the ancient religious texts were literally true, that beneath our feet, just 12 kilometers down through the Earth's crust, the domain of Satan and the suffering dead actually exists not as metaphor or spiritual realm, but as physical location accessible through sufficiently deep excavation. The story included details that gave it credibility: the specific location in Russia's Kola Peninsula, the depth of 12 kilometers, which matched real data from the actual borehole project. Quotes attributed to Dr. Azakov, the alleged chief scientist who reportedly said the project was terminated because what they discovered was too terrifying to continue investigating. And most compellingly, the claimed audio recording itself, which circulated on cassette tapes and later online. Several seconds of chaotic screaming and wailing that sounded like thousands of voices in torment, allegedly captured by scientific instruments deployed into the cavity they'd breached. The story spread rapidly through Christian communities, appearing in magazines and newsletters, being repeated from pulpits, shared as testimony to the reality of hell and the truth of Scripture, becoming so widespread that it was treated as established fact by significant portions of evangelical Christianity, despite immediately raising questions about its authenticity, despite the obvious problems with the narrative, despite the lack of verification from any legitimate news sources or scientific institutions, despite eventually being thoroughly debunked as hoax, as deliberate fabrication created by combining real details about the Kola borehole with fictional elements and manufactured audio, yet persisting decades later in conspiracy theory communities and fundamentalist circles, where it continues to be cited as evidence that hell is real and located in the Earth's interior, and that scientists accidentally proved this in 1989 before suppressing the discovery, making the sounds from hell one of the most successful religious urban legends of modern times. A story that either documents the most significant theological and scientific discovery in human history, or documents how easily fabricated stories can spread when they tell people what they want to believe, when they confirm existing religious convictions about the reality of hell and divine judgment, leaving the well-to-hell story hovering between testified to fact and demonstrated hoax, between evidence of literal hell and evidence of human gullibility, between proof that spiritual realms have physical locations and proof that conspiracy theories and religious legends can survive debunking indefinitely if the audience has sufficient motivation to believe them. The Kola Super Deep borehole is real. It exists on the Kola Peninsula in northwestern Russia, was drilled between 1970 and 1994 as scientific research project studying the Earth's crust, and reached a depth of 12,262 meters, making it the deepest artificial point on Earth until exceeded by oil wells, using different drilling techniques in later decades. The project was legitimate science, investigating deep geology, testing theories about crustal composition, studying seismic discontinuities, and gathering data about Earth's interior that couldn't be obtained through surface observation. The borehole hit unexpectedly high temperatures at depth, over 180 degrees Celsius at 12 kilometers, which exceeded predictions and eventually made further drilling impractical because conventional drill bits couldn't function in those conditions. The project was closed in 1994 for economic and technical reasons following the Soviet Union's collapse, not because they discovered hell. The Well to Hell story appears to have originated with a Finnish Christian newsletter in 1989, which published an article claiming the discovery had occurred and that scientists had been terrified by what they found. The story was then picked up by Trinity Broadcasting Network in the United States, where it was broadcast on Christian television and spread rapidly through evangelical communities. The supposed scientist, Dr. Azakoff, appears to be fictional. No records of a geologist or seismologist by that name associated with the Kola project exist. The quotes attributed to him have never been verified in any Soviet scientific publication or documentation from the actual project. The audio recording that supposedly captures the screams from hell has been analyzed and appears to be fabricated from multiple sources. Audio forensics suggests it's a composite of horror movie sound effects, manipulated recordings of crowds, and possibly animal sounds processed to sound human-like, layered together to create chaotic screaming that doesn't have the acoustic characteristics of sound recorded in the specific environmental conditions that would exist in a deep borehole. The recording also doesn't match what would be captured by the temperature-resistant microphones that would have been used in actual deep Earth research. Such equipment would produce very different audio quality and frequency response than what appears in the circulated recording. The physics of the claimed discovery are problematic. Sound requires a medium to travel, typically air, and the cavity described in the story would need to be enormous and filled with air at depth, which is geologically implausible. The temperatures and pressures at 12 kilometers depth would make any air-filled cavity impossible to maintain, and any sounds generated at that depth would be transmitted through rock as seismic waves rather than as airborne audio that could be recorded by conventional microphones. The entire scenario is incompatible with what we know about Earth's interior structure and the physical behavior of sound. The theological implications of the story are also problematic from within Christian frameworks. Biblical descriptions of hell typically don't locate it as physical cavity in Earth's crust, but rather as spiritual realm or as metaphorical description of separation from God. Most theological traditions understand hell as existing outside physical space-time rather than as accessible through geological drilling. The story's literal interpretation, hell as physical location 12 kilometers below surface, represents folk theology rather than scholarly religious understanding, appealing to fundamentalist literalism that reads scriptural metaphors as physical descriptions. Yet the story persists. Decades after being debunked, after the fabrication has been documented, after the audio has been shown to be fake and the scientists shown to be fictional, and the entire narrative demonstrated to be hoax, the Well to Hell story continues to circulate. It appears in conspiracy theory compilations, gets shared on social media, is presented in fundamentalist Christian contexts as evidence of hell's reality, is cited by people who either don't know it's been debunked or who reject the debunking as part of atheist or scientific conspiracy to suppress evidence of the spiritual realm. This persistence reveals something about how belief systems interact with information. For people whose religious identity and worldview depend on hell being literally real, a story claiming scientific proof of hell's existence is powerfully attractive, confirms what they already believe, provides evidence they can cite when challenged by skeptics. Once accepted into their belief system, the story becomes resistant to correction because rejecting it would require acknowledging they were fooled. would weaken their ability to argue for their religious positions, would remove a piece of evidence they've been using to support their faith. The mechanism of debunking resistance involves motivated reasoning and source credibility judgments. If someone believes the story is true and it's important to their worldview, they're motivated to find reasons to reject debunking attempts. They can question the credibility of skeptical sources. Scientists and fact-checkers might be lying to suppress religious truth. They can argue that absence of verification doesn't prove the story is false. Records might have been destroyed or suppressed. The scientist might have used a pseudonym for safety. The audio might be authentic even if its provenance can't be established. As long as the story can't be definitively disproven to their satisfaction, and what would constitute definitive disproof to someone sufficiently motivated to believe, they can continue accepting it. The Well to Hell story also functions as modern folklore, as urban legend that serves cultural purposes beyond its truth value. It expresses anxiety about scientific materialism, about the erosion of religious certainty in modern secular societies, about the fear that science is trying to eliminate God and the spiritual realm from human understanding. The story pushes back against this, suggests that even atheist scientists conducting secular research can't escape divine reality, that hell exists whether they believe in it or not, that their instruments will record spiritual truth even when their minds refuse to acknowledge it. It's revenge fantasy for religious believers who feel marginalized by scientific authority. A story where the scientists are forced to confront that they were wrong, that the religious were right all along, that reality includes the spiritual dimensions that materialism denies. The comparison to other false stories that persist despite debunking is instructive. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion continues to circulate despite being proven fabricated anti-Semitic propaganda. Moon landing denial persists despite overwhelming evidence the landings occurred. Flat Earth belief exists despite trivial ability to demonstrate Earth's sphericity. In each case, the false narrative serves psychological or ideological needs for believers that truth-based correction can't address. The Well to Hell story similarly serves needs: validation of religious belief, confirmation of hell's reality, evidence to use in evangelism, that make it valuable regardless of its factual status. The ethical dimension involves whether sharing known false stories is justified if it serves religious purposes. Some who spread the Well to Hell story know it's fabricated, but argue that if it brings people to faith, if it makes hell's reality vivid and motivates repentance, then the deception is justified as noble lie, as tool for achieving greater spiritual truth, even through factual falsehood. Others argue this is deeply problematic, that faith built on false testimony is compromised, that when the falsehood is revealed, it undermines credibility of religious claims generally, that truth matters intrinsically, and using lies to promote religious belief is self-defeating and ethically wrong. The original fabricator's motives remain unclear. Was it deliberate hoax intended to fool credulous believers, prank, or social experiment to see how quickly false story would spread through religious communities? Was it sincere but mistaken belief by someone who combined fragmentary information about the Kola Project with religious imagination, creating story they believed might be true and sharing it without adequate verification? Was it evangelical tool, fabrication intended to serve faith by making hell vivid and real to audiences that might be wavering in belief? The anonymity of early internet and newsletter distribution means the original source can't be identified and interviewed to determine intent. The lesson extends beyond this specific hoax to questions about how we evaluate extraordinary claims. The Well to Hell story contained verifiable elements. The Kola borehole existed, reached the claimed depth, was Soviet scientific project, mixed with unverifiable elements, the cavity, the recording, the scientist's quotes, the project cancellation reason. This mixing of real and false details is characteristic of successful hoaxes, making the story seem plausible enough to avoid immediate dismissal, while the unverifiable elements carry the actual extraordinary claims. Effective fact-checking requires not just verifying that some details are accurate, but checking whether the extraordinary claims specifically are supported by credible evidence, which in this case they weren't. The scientific response to the story has been consistent dismissal. Geologists and seismologists have repeatedly explained why the claimed discovery is physically impossible, why the audio couldn't be authentic, why the scenario violates known facts about Earth's interior. But scientific authority doesn't persuade audiences that distrust science or that believe scientists are part of atheist conspiracy to suppress religious truth. The expertise that makes scientists credible sources on geological questions is exactly what makes them suspect sources for believers who think scientific materialism is fundamentally wrong about spiritual reality. Whether hell exists as spiritual reality, as state of separation from God, as metaphorical description of suffering, or doesn't exist at all, the Well to Hell story doesn't provide evidence for any of these positions because the story itself is fabricated, the audio is fake, the scientist is fictional, and the claimed events didn't occur. The Kola Super Deep borehole is impressive engineering and valuable science, but it didn't drill into hell because hell as physical cavity in Earth's crust doesn't exist. Because screams don't travel through rock at 12-kilometer depths in ways that could be recorded by microphones. Because the temperature and pressure conditions make the entire scenario impossible, leaving the Well to Hell as what it is. Successful religious hoax that continues circulating decades after debunking because it tells story that significant audience wants to believe, that confirms their religious worldview, that provides them with narrative and evidence they find useful despite its falsity, making it case study in how misinformation persists not through lack of debunking, but through motivated belief, through audience that needs the story to be true more than they need truth, through communities that value the story's religious utility over its factual accuracy, leaving the Well to Hell story permanently circulating through fundamentalist Christianity and conspiracy theory networks, where it will continue appearing as testimony, as evidence, as proof of hell's reality. Despite being none of those things, despite being demonstrated fabrication, despite the Kola borehole, scientists never recording screams, never breaking into cavity, never fleeing in terror from proof of hell, because none of that happened. Because the story is false. Because the sounds from hell were created in recording studio or assembled from sound effects library, not captured by instruments deployed into Earth's crust, not transmitted from suffering souls, not evidence of anything except human capacity to create and spread false stories when those stories serve psychological or religious purposes that make truth secondary to utility, leaving the Well to Hell hovering as it always has between repeated claim and demonstrated falsehood, between testimonial and hoax, between evidence believers. Site and fabrication skeptics document existing in permanent tension between communities that need it to be true and research that proves it isn't, between faith that wants scientific confirmation and science that doesn't provide it, between the story and the reality, between the claimed recording of screams from hell and the actual silence of the Kola Super Deep borehole that penetrated 12 kilometers into Earth's crust and found not souls in torment, but only rock and heat, and the geological processes that our planet has conducted for billions of years without supernatural intervention, without spiritual realms accessible through drilling, without hell waiting in the depths to be discovered by Soviet scientists, leaving only the borehole itself as monument to human engineering and scientific curiosity, and the story of screams from hell as monument to human credulity, and religious imagination, to our capacity to create legends that outlive debunking, that persist through sheer determination of belief, that continue spreading despite being false because they serve purposes that don't require truth, that exist in spaces where factual accuracy matters less than psychological utility, where stories function regardless of whether they describe actual events, where the well to hell remains eternally both claimed and disproven, both testified to and debunked, both evidence and fabrication, depending on who's telling it, who's listening, and whether truth or belief matters more in that particular moment, that particular community, that particular conversation about whether hell is real and whether science proved it in 1989, when Soviet scientists allegedly drilled too deep and heard the screams that confirmed ancient religious truth, or heard nothing except the natural processes of Earth's interior. Because the story never happened, was always false, remains demonstrably fabricated, yet continues its own form of eternal persistence, not in hell, but in the infinite circulation of internet and belief, where false stories never quite die, never quite get fully rejected, always find new audiences who haven't heard the debunking or who choose not to accept it, keeping the well-to-hell story alive decades after its creation, decades after its refutation, permanently suspended between claim and fact, between testimony and hoax, between the recording that supposedly captured hell and the silence that actually exists 12 kilometers beneath. The surface where the Kola borehole reached and where scientists found exactly what geology predicted, and nothing that scripture claimed, nothing supernatural, nothing spiritual, nothing that would support the story that nonetheless continues spreading, continues being believed, continues functioning as modern legend regardless of its relationship to truth. The Devil's Footprints, unexplained tracks across 100 miles. On the morning of February 9th, 1855, residents of Devon, England woke to find fresh snow bearing tracks that would defy explanation for over a century and a half afterward. The prints appeared to have been made during the night, creating a trail that extended across more than 100 miles of countryside, crossing the rooftops of houses, scaling 14-foot walls, passing through narrow pipes and drainages that no normal creature could navigate, continuing in an unbroken line across the River Exe, where no bridge existed, ascending and descending without deviation from their perfectly straight course. The prints themselves were distinctive and deeply disturbing. They resembled hoof marks, small impressions roughly 4 inches long by 2 3/4 inches wide, but they appeared in single file, one after another in a perfectly straight line, as if whatever made them walked on 2 legs rather than 4, as if a bipedal creature with hooves had walked through Devon that night, covering impossible distance, traversing impossible obstacles, leaving a trail that suggested not an animal or human, but something else entirely, something that moved according to rules that didn't match any creature known to exist, something that people immediately, instinctively, identified with the devil himself. Because what else walks with hooves, in a straight line across 100 miles, over rooftops and through spaces too small for anything to pass, leaving tracks that appeared nowhere near human or animal, but rather like something from hell had decided to tour the English countryside and left its signature for everyone to see when morning came. The tracks were discovered by dozens of independent witnesses across multiple towns and villages: Topsham, Lympston, Exmouth, Teignmouth, Dawlish, and locations between, all reporting the same phenomenon: a line of hoof-like prints in fresh snow that had fallen overnight, spaced consistently about 8 inches apart, creating a trail that didn't meander or circle, but proceeded in almost militarily straight courses, as if whatever made them was moving with deliberate purpose from point A to point B, and nothing, not walls, not buildings, not rivers, was going to deter it from its path. The consistency of the reports is what makes the incident so compelling. These weren't isolated claims from a single location that could be dismissed as hoax or misidentification. Multiple communities witnessed the same tracks, described them in identical terms, and were collectively baffled by how any creature could have created them, given their distribution and the obstacles they crossed. The tracks went over rooftops, not around houses, but up one side, across the roof, and down the other side, maintaining the same spacing and appearance, as if gravity didn't affect whatever made them, as if walking vertically up a wall and across a pitched roof was as natural as walking on flat ground. They appeared on top of 14-foot walls, where snow hadn't been disturbed by any obvious means of ascent, as if whatever left them simply materialized at the top, or walked up the vertical surface. They continued through a haystack, entering one side, passing through the center where tunneling should have collapsed the structure, and emerging on the other side. They crossed the River Exe, appearing on both banks despite the water being too cold for most creatures to swim, and no evidence of disturbance suggesting something had swum across. The spacing was unnaturally precise, 8 inches between each print, unwavering across the entire distance. No variation in stride length, no irregularities that would be expected from a living creature navigating varied terrain. Living things adjust their gait when climbing, when descending, when moving through difficult obstacles. These tracks maintained mechanical consistency, as if stamped by a device or created by something that moved with machine-like regularity, regardless of what it was traversing. The prints themselves showed no variation in depth. They pressed into the snow uniformly, whether on flat ground, steep inclines, or the peaks of rooftops, suggesting whatever made them didn't have weight distribution that changed with angle, or didn't have weight, in the conventional sense that would press harder when climbing or lighter when descending. The shape of the prints was the most disturbing element. They resembled horseshoes or donkey hooves, but were smaller than any actual horse would produce. And crucially, they appeared in single file rather than the paired pattern that 4-legged animals create. Something with hooves was walking on 2 legs, or something with 2-hooved feet was walking, or something entirely different was leaving marks that happened to resemble hooves, because that's the closest visual analog human perception could construct from what was actually being impressed into the snow. The prints showed no signs of toes or claws that might indicate some other creature's track being misinterpreted. They were hoof-shaped, consistently so, across the entire 100-mile trail. The historical documentation is substantial because the incident occurred in Victorian England, where literacy was high, newspapers were active, and the phenomenon was significant enough that multiple accounts were published in the weeks following the discovery. The Illustrated London News covered it extensively. The Times received letters from witnesses. Local papers documented the tracks in their communities, and investigators attempted to follow and study them before the snow melted, and they disappeared. This contemporary documentation rules out the possibility that the Devil's footprints are modern fabrication or internet legend. They're documented 19th century phenomenon, witnessed by hundreds of people and reported in credible publications of the era. The theories proposed at the time ranged from the mundane to the supernatural. Some suggested the tracks were made by badgers, though badgers create completely different prints, don't walk in single file, and wouldn't cover 100 miles in one night or cross rivers and climb walls. Others proposed kangaroos, which would be absurd, except that a few kangaroos had recently been imported to private estates in England, raising the remote possibility that an escaped marsupial made some of the tracks. But kangaroos create distinctive prints, bound rather than walk, and one kangaroo couldn't have been in multiple locations simultaneously across such vast distance. Hares, otters, rats, various birds. All were suggested and all failed to account for the characteristics of the prints or the scope of their distribution. Balloons were proposed. Perhaps some scientific apparatus suspended from a balloon had dragged across the snow, creating the trail. But this doesn't explain the precision of the prints, the fact that they went through enclosed spaces and over obstacles that would have caught or deflected any suspended object, or how a balloon could have maintained such a straight course for 100 miles on a night when wind would have caused irregular drift. The balloon theory requires assuming the prints were made by something dragging from a flying object, but the prints showed defined shapes pressing down into snow, not the smeared or erratic marks that dragging would create. The supernatural explanation that many witnesses embraced immediately was that Satan himself or a demon had walked through Devon that night. The hoof marks were his signature, his calling card, evidence that evil had a physical presence and had chosen to manifest in southern England for reasons that could only be terrifying. The Victorian era was religious and superstitious enough that this explanation was taken seriously by significant portions of the population. Churches were packed the following Sunday as people sought protection and understanding. Some refused to leave their homes after dark. The psychological impact was profound. An entire region had been confronted with physical evidence that something incomprehensible and potentially malevolent had moved through their communities while they slept. The hoax theory is inevitable. Perhaps someone or a group created the tracks deliberately to cause panic or confusion. But the logistics of creating a 100-mile trail of consistent prints across multiple communities, over rooftops and walls, in a single night without being observed by anyone, using a method that produced perfectly spaced, hoof-shaped impressions, defeats plausibility. The effort required would be enormous, the risk of discovery high, and the absence of any confession or evidence of the hoax in the subsequent century and a half suggests that if it was a hoax, it was executed with sophistication that exceeds almost any documented historical prank. Modern theories have proposed unusual weather phenomena, cyclones or atmospheric conditions that created patterns in the snow that looked like prints. But meteorological formations don't create discrete, hoof-shaped impressions spaced regularly. Don't follow straight courses over varied terrain, and don't press into snow with the definition that witnesses described. Natural snow formations can create strange patterns, but they don't mimic the appearance of an animal track with such consistency that multiple observers in different locations describe them identically. Some researchers have suggested the tracks were made by multiple animals, that what appeared to be a continuous trail was actually several different sets of tracks from different creatures that coincidentally created a pattern that seemed connected. This might explain the distribution, but struggles with the consistency of description. Witnesses weren't describing vaguely similar tracks. They were describing identical tracks that appeared to be part of a single trail. Unless multiple creatures of the same species all decided to walk through Devon on the same night, following similar paths and producing identical prints, the coincidence required makes this explanation implausible. There are also theories involving experimental technology or vehicles that were being tested in the area and that created the tracks as a byproduct of their operation. Victorian England was the height of the Industrial Revolution, and secret experiments were certainly conducted. But what technology in 1855 could produce this effect? What device could traverse 100 miles, scale buildings, cross rivers, and leave precisely spaced hoof-like impressions without being seen or heard by anyone? The technology required seems far beyond what was available in that era, unless we assume classified development that was decades ahead of publicly known capabilities. The interdimensional theory proposes that the tracks were made by something not from our physical reality, but from an adjacent dimension or space that occasionally intersects with ours. If an entity from elsewhere passed through Devon that night, existing partially in our dimension and partially in its own, it might have left traces, physical impressions from whatever contact it made with our reality, while its actual form remained largely imperceptible to normal observation. This would explain why nothing was seen creating the tracks, why the tracks have characteristics that don't match any known creature, and why they appear to violate normal physics by going over obstacles without difficulty. The entity was moving through space that included both our dimension and others, and the tracks are the artifact of that movement impressing on our physical snow. The Devil's footprints were not unique to 1855. Similar phenomena have been reported in other times and places, though rarely with the documentation and witness scope of the Devon incident. In 1953, residents of Belgium reported mysterious tracks in snow that crossed improbable terrain and sparked similar speculation. Various reports from Russia, Scandinavia, and North America describe finding trails of prints that don't match known animals and that appear in locations or patterns that defy normal explanation. These subsequent incidents suggest the phenomenon isn't unique to Devon in 1855, but rather represents something that occurs rarely, but repeatedly, something that occasionally manifests and leaves physical traces before disappearing back into whatever state it normally occupies. The psychological residue of the Devil's footprints lingers in Devon to this day. The incident is part of local history, commemorated and debated, with residents aware that their region was the site of something that was never explained, that left evidence too substantial to dismiss, but too strange to categorize. The mystery has an official quality, documented in newspapers and letters from the time, impossible to relegate to pure folklore or legend, because the primary sources exist. The contemporary accounts are too numerous and too consistent to ignore. What actually walked through Devon that February night remains unknown. Whether it was a creature unknown to science, an animal behaving in ways that don't match our understanding of animal behavior, a hoax executed with impossible sophistication, an atmospheric phenomenon that created illusions of purposeful tracks, a demonic entity leaving its mark on the physical world, an interdimensional traveler whose passage left impressions in our reality, or something else entirely that we lack the framework to even conceptualize. The tracks existed, were seen by hundreds of witnesses, were documented by credible sources, and have never been explained in ways that satisfy all the evidence. The prints covered over 100 miles, crossed obstacles that shouldn't be crossable, maintained consistency that shouldn't be achievable by any living creature moving through varied terrain, and then disappeared when the snow melted, leaving only the accounts and the persistent question of what could possibly create such a trail. The name Devil's Footprints reflects the immediate interpretation that something infernal had made them, that hooves in the snow could only mean one thing to a Christian population steeped in imagery of cloven-hoofed demons. But whether the interpretation was correct, whether something actually demonic walked through Devon, or whether the tracks came from a source that had nothing to do with religious concepts of evil, but that happened to create marks that matched those expectations, the incident remains as one of history's most documented and least explained anomalies. Something left tracks across southern England in 1855. Something walked or moved through multiple communities in a single night. Something impressed marks into fresh snow that looked like hooves, that followed straight lines across impossible distances and impossible obstacles, that have never been satisfactorily explained despite a century and a half of investigation and speculation. The Devil's Footprints walked through Devon once and left behind a mystery that endures because the evidence was too real to dismiss, too strange to explain, too consistent across too many witnesses to attribute to error or imagination. proving that sometimes the world produces phenomena that defy every attempt at rational explanation, that leave physical traces no theory can fully account for, that remain as permanent questions in the historical record, marks in the snow that melted away, but that the mystery they represent has never dissolved, has never been resolved, remains as vivid now as it was the morning residents of Devon looked out their windows and saw that something with hooves had walked through their world during the night, had left its signature across 100 miles of countryside, and had vanished before dawn without anyone seeing what made the marks. What walked with such inhuman consistency and such improbable ability to traverse obstacles? What left its calling card in the snow and then disappeared back into whatever realm it came from, leaving only the tracks, only the mystery, only the certainty that something happened that February night in 1855 that no one has ever managed to fully explain, something that walked where it shouldn't have been able to walk, left prints that shouldn't exist, and entered history as the Devil's Footprints, a name that captures both the appearance of the evidence and the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what they were. What? The elevator game, Riding Between Dimensions. There's a game that circulates through online communities and urban legend exchanges, instructions that claim if you follow a specific sequence of button presses in a particular type of elevator, a building with at least 10 floors, riding alone, performing a precise ritual of ascending and descending in a pattern that makes no practical sense, you can access an alternate dimension, a parallel version of reality that exists alongside our own, but that's normally inaccessible, separated by barriers that the elevator game somehow allows you to breach. The instructions are specific. Enter the elevator alone, press the buttons in sequence, 4th floor, 2nd floor, 6th floor, 2nd floor again, 10th floor. And when you reach the 10th floor, don't exit even if someone enters. And if a woman enters on the 10th floor, whatever you do, don't look at her, don't speak to her, don't acknowledge her presence because she isn't human. She's something else, a guardian or entity that exists at the threshold between dimensions. If she speaks to you, remain silent. If she doesn't enter, or if you successfully ignore her, press the button for the 5th floor. And if the elevator goes up instead of down, if it ascends past the 10th floor to somewhere that shouldn't exist, you've succeeded in crossing over to the other world. The alternate dimension where everything looks almost like our reality, but wrong. Empty, red-tinted, where you might be the only person, where electronics don't work properly, where the rules are different, and where leaving requires performing the ritual in reverse. If you can find an elevator that still functions, if the woman doesn't prevent you, if you remember the sequence correctly, if the dimension allows you to leave at all. Hundreds of people claim to have played the elevator game, some reporting that nothing happened, that they rode elevators pressing random buttons and felt foolish for believing internet legends. But others claiming they did cross over, that they experienced the other world briefly before fleeing back, and a very few claiming they went too far, stayed too long, encountered things in that empty red world that they won't describe, but that left them changed, that made them understand. The elevator game isn't game at all, but is genuine doorway to somewhere we're not supposed to go, somewhere that exists parallel to our reality, accessible through this bizarre elevator ritual that sounds like creepypasta nonsense until you try it and discover that maybe, impossibly, the instructions actually work, that elevators can be portals, that dimensional travel is possible through precise manipulation of architectural spaces that weren't designed for this purpose, but that somehow, under specific conditions, with specific sequences, allow crossing between worlds that normally remain separate, leaving players with the choice of whether to believe the warnings, whether to attempt the ritual, whether to risk encountering the woman on the 10th floor and discovering whether the other world is real, or whether the elevator game is just another urban legend Another internet myth that preys on human desire to believe that magic and mystery still exist, that hidden dimensions wait behind the mundane architecture of apartment buildings and hotels, accessible to anyone brave or foolish enough to ride alone through the sequence, through the pattern that either opens doorways between realities or just makes you look absurd, pushing elevator buttons in strange order, depending on whether the game works, whether the other dimension exists, whether the woman is real, and whether you're willing to find out. The elevator game appears to have originated in South Korea, circulating in online communities as El Ribiteo Game, before spreading internationally through creepypasta sites, Reddit threads, YouTube videos, and other platforms where urban legends and ritual games propagate. The Korean origin is significant because elevator-related supernatural beliefs are particularly strong in East Asian cultures, where elevators and other liminal transitional spaces are often associated with spiritual activity, where the boundary between floors or levels is seen as threshold where different realms can touch, where spirits can enter our world, or where humans can accidentally cross into spirit realms. The specificity of the instructions gives the ritual an air of authenticity, as if these are genuine directions for a real phenomenon rather than fictional elements of a story. The exact button sequence, 4th, 2nd, 6th, 2nd, 10th, has variations across different versions of the game, but the core structure remains consistent. A pattern that requires moving between floors in a sequence that makes no practical sense, that would be inefficient for any normal elevator use, that serves no purpose except as ritual, as formula, as the specific combination that allegedly opens the doorway. The woman who appears on the 10th floor is described consistently across accounts as wearing dark clothing, having long dark hair covering her face, emanating a sense of wrongness or danger that makes players instinctively want to leave the elevator immediately. She's identified in some versions as not being from our dimension, as being a guardian or test, as something that players must resist interacting with to proceed further. The specific warning not to look at her, not to speak to her, parallels folklore from multiple cultures about encounters with supernatural entities, where acknowledgement or interaction creates connection or danger, where ignoring the entity is the safest response, even though every instinct screams to react to someone entering your elevator. The detail that the elevator will ascend when you press the 5th floor button, going up instead of down despite being on the 10th floor, is the moment that supposedly indicates successful dimensional crossing. An elevator ascending from the top floor violates the physical constraint that should prevent it, suggesting you've left normal space-time where the 10th floor is the highest point, and entered a space where the elevator can go beyond the building's actual structure, where architectural limits no longer apply because you're no longer in the architecture you started in, but rather in its dimensional reflection or alternate version. The other world is described as red-tinted or lit by red light, as being mostly empty of people, as having familiar architecture but wrong atmosphere, as a place where you might see distant lights or shapes, but no actual people, or where the only other person you encounter is the woman who has followed you or who exists in both dimensions. Electronics are said to malfunction, phones don't work, cameras fail, the normal connections to the wider world are severed, leaving you isolated in this alternate space with no way to call for help or document what you're experiencing. The escape instructions involve returning to the elevator, pressing the button sequence in reverse, or in a different pattern that supposedly returns you to normal reality, assuming you can find an elevator that operates, assuming you remember the sequence, assuming the dimension allows you to leave. Some versions warn that you must leave before a certain time limit, that staying too long causes you to become stuck, unable to return, trapped in the empty alternate world permanently. Others warn that the woman will try to prevent your departure, will appear in the elevator, will speak or touch you, to create connection that anchors you to the alternate dimension and prevents return. The documented attempts are numerous but difficult to verify. YouTube contains countless videos of people claiming to attempt the elevator game. Though most show nothing unusual, people pressing buttons, riding elevators, experiencing normal elevator behavior, sometimes claiming they felt strange or scared, but without any objective documentation of dimensional crossing. The handful of videos that show unusual events, elevator lights flickering, strange sounds, the elevator moving in unexpected ways, are ambiguous, potentially explainable through normal elevator malfunction or through video editing and hoaxing. The compelling accounts come from text-based stories shared in paranormal communities, detailed first-person narratives of people who claim they performed the ritual and experienced the crossing, who describe the red-tinted world, the emptiness, the overwhelming desire to leave immediately, the terror of being alone in a dimension that looks almost like home, but that's fundamentally wrong. These narratives are effective horror writing regardless of their truth status, creating visceral sense of wrongness and isolation that resonates psychologically, even if the events described never actually occurred. The question of whether anyone has actually crossed dimensions through the elevator game versus whether people have experienced psychological states that they interpreted as dimensional crossing is central. Elevators are inherently disorienting spaces, enclosed, moving, with limited sensory input, designed to be transitional and temporary. Performing a ritual in an elevator, focusing attention on buttons and floors, and watching for anomalies creates heightened state of awareness and anxiety that could produce perceptual distortions, could make normal elevator behavior seem strange or significant, could generate strong emotions and experiences that feel real, even if they're purely psychological. The ritual elements create self-fulfilling prophecy potential. If you believe the game works, if you're nervous and hyper-alert while performing it, if you're primed to interpret any unusual sensation as evidence of dimensional crossing, your perception and memory can construct experiences that seem to validate the belief. The woman on the 10th floor might be any person who happens to enter at that point, transformed in memory and perception into the supernatural entity the ritual describes. The red tinting might be perceptual artifact of stress and reduced oxygen in enclosed space, or might be suggestion creating visual experience that isn't externally real, but that feels genuine to the experiencer. But this psychological explanation, while plausible, doesn't account for the specific consistency across reports, the particular details that appear in independent accounts. The fact that people attempting the game without believing in it sometimes report unusual experiences that disturb them enough to share despite their skepticism. Either the psychological effects of the ritual are powerful enough to produce consistent hallucinatory or perceptual phenomena across different individuals, or something else is happening that we don't have framework for explaining. The dimensional travel hypothesis takes the game literally, proposes that elevators under specific conditions and through specific manipulation can create portals or interfaces with parallel dimensions. This would require physics far beyond current understanding, would require that dimensions exist adjacent to ours in ways that architectural spaces can bridge, would require that human intention or ritual can affect dimensional barriers, creating access where normally none exists. The mechanism by which pressing elevator buttons in sequence would open dimensional doorways isn't specified and isn't apparent from any known physics, making this explanation scientifically untenable but narratively compelling. The tulpa or egregore interpretation suggests that the elevator game has become real through collective belief, that the thousands of people who know about it and think about it and attempt it have created genuine phenomenon through focused attention and expectation, manifesting the woman and the alternate dimension through the power of shared mental energy. or through mechanisms of consciousness that materialism doesn't acknowledge. In this framework, the game works now because enough people believe it works, regardless of whether it worked originally or whether it was ever intended to be real rather than fiction. The dangers, if real, are emphasized in the warnings that accompany the instructions. Players are cautioned to ensure they can complete the ritual, to not stay in the alternate dimension longer than necessary, to avoid the woman at all costs, to follow the return sequence exactly, to be prepared for the possibility that return might not be possible. These warnings serve narrative functions, building tension, creating stakes, making the game feel consequential. But they also serve protective functions if the phenomenon is real, warning off casual attempts while providing safety guidelines for those determined to try. The comparison to other ritual games is inevitable. Bloody Mary, the Midnight Man, the Three Kings, and numerous other ritual practices that circulate through youth culture and online communities share characteristics with the elevator game: specific instructions, alleged supernatural results, warnings about dangers, mix of believers and skeptics, and difficulty determining whether any of it is real versus purely psychological or fictional. These games serve social functions, create shared experiences, test courage, provide frameworks for exploring fear and mystery, whether or not they produce genuine supernatural effects. The liminal space aspect is central. Elevators are quintessentially liminal, spaces of transition, neither here nor there, between floors, between destinations, temporary enclosures where normal social rules are suspended and where strangers are forced into uncomfortable proximity. This liminality makes them psychologically potent, makes them feel like spaces where unusual things might happen, where normal reality might be less stable. The elevator game exploits this existing psychological association, using the inherent strangeness of elevator space to create ritual that feels like it should work, that feels appropriate to the space it utilizes. The persistence and spread of the game demonstrate its cultural resonance. It continues to circulate years after first appearing, continues to attract new participants, continues to generate reports and discussions and warnings. This persistence suggests it's serving psychological or social needs, need for mystery, for experiences that transcend mundane reality, for shared cultural practices that create bonds and stories, for testing personal courage against alleged supernatural threats. Whether the game actually produces dimensional crossing becomes almost secondary to its function as cultural practice, as shared mythology that gives meaning and structure to elevator-related anxiety and liminal space discomfort. The question of whether you should attempt the elevator game, if you're curious, ultimately depends on what you believe and what you're looking for. If you're seeking verifiable proof of dimensional travel, you're unlikely to find it. The experiences reported are subjective and ambiguous, not producing physical evidence that could convince skeptics. If you're seeking personal experience of mystery and fear, the ritual might provide that regardless of whether anything supernatural occurs, purely through the psychological effects of performing the ritual in isolation, of focusing attention on possibility of the uncanny, of creating conditions where perceptual anomalies feel significant. The elevator game exists in the space between real and fictional, between psychological and supernatural, between cultural practice and genuine phenomenon. It might be nothing more than creepypasta that's been taken seriously by people who want to believe in accessible magic and hidden dimensions. It might be psychological exercise that produces powerful subjective experiences through ritual and suggestion without anything objectively unusual occurring. Or it might be, impossibly, what it claims to be: actual technique for accessing alternate dimensions through elevator manipulation, doorway, hidden in plain sight, ritual that works for reasons we don't understand, through mechanisms we don't possess frameworks for analyzing, making the woman on the 10th floor real, making the red world real, making dimensional travel possible for anyone willing to ride alone through the sequence and risk discovering that the warnings were accurate, that some games aren't games, that some rituals produce real effects, and that elevators designed merely to move people between floors can, under specific conditions, become something else entirely, become portals, become thresholds, become access points to dimensions that exist parallel to our own, waiting behind the architecture, accessible through the pattern, through the ritual, through the elevator game that thousands have attempted and that remains forever ambiguous, forever uncertain, forever hovering between elaborate hoax and genuine mystery, between psychological phenomenon and dimensional doorway, between creepypasta and reality, leaving players to decide for themselves whether to press the buttons, whether to ride alone through the sequence, whether to find out if the woman appears, whether to discover if the elevator ascends when it should descend, whether to learn if the other world is real, or if they'll simply ride a normal elevator, pressing random buttons while feeling foolish for believing internet legends about dimensional travel through elevator ritual, about games that aren't games, about architectural spaces that become portals, about the woman on the 10th floor who guards the threshold, about the red world waiting just beyond normal reality, accessible allegedly through this bizarre sequence of button presses that either opens doorways between dimensions or does absolutely nothing except waste time and make you look strange to anyone watching elevator security cameras, leaving the elevator game as it is and as it will likely remain: popular, persistent, disturbing, compelling, unverified, ambiguous, possibly real, and possibly fictional. Definitely effective at generating experiences that people interpret as significant whether or not anything supernatural actually occurred, making it perfect modern urban legend, perfect internet age myth, perfect liminal space ritual that exploits elevator psychology and dimensional possibility and human desire to believe that hidden worlds exist and that access requires only knowledge of the sequence, only willingness to ride alone, only courage to face the woman if she appears, and to enter the red world if the elevator ascends. Discovering finally whether the elevator game works, or whether it was always just story, always just legend, always just another creepypasta that people wanted to believe in badly enough that they convinced themselves it was real, riding elevators, pressing buttons in strange patterns, searching for dimensional doorways that either exist or don't, that either open or don't, that either lead to alternate realities or lead only to disappointment, and the realization that not every ritual produces magic, that not every legend describes truth, that sometimes elevators are just elevators and button sequences are just button sequences, and the woman never appears because she was never real, and the other world doesn't exist because dimensions don't work that way. And the elevator game is simply game, simply fiction, simply one more way. Humans try to inject mystery into mundane architecture, to find portals in ordinary spaces, to believe that somewhere, somehow, just beyond the normal world, alternate dimensions wait, accessible to anyone who knows the pattern, who performs the ritual, who plays the elevator game, and discovers whether it works or whether they've been fooled by internet legend into pressing random buttons alone in elevators, hoping for dimensional travel that never comes. That was never possible. That exists only in stories and in the perpetual human hope that maybe this time, this ritual, this sequence, this elevator will be different, will open the doorway, will prove the legend true, will take them to the other world where the rules change and reality becomes fluid, and nothing is quite what it seems. The red world, the empty world, the alternate dimension that might be real or might be fiction, but that remains forever accessible in imagination. And perhaps, just perhaps, through the elevator game, through the sequence, through the ritual that continues to spread and continues to be attempted, and continues to generate experiences that people interpret as proof or as delusion depending on their frameworks and their beliefs, and whether they think dimensional travel through elevator manipulation is possible or impossible. Leaving the question open, leaving the game available, leaving the instructions circulating through internet communities, where they'll continue to find new players, new believers, new skeptics, new people willing to ride alone through the sequence to discover for themselves whether elevators can be portals, whether dimensions can be crossed, whether the woman is real, whether the other world exists, whether the elevator game is genuine doorway, or elaborate fiction that convinced thousands of people to press buttons in strange patterns while hoping for magic that never manifests, that was never there, that might never have been real except in the collective imagination where the elevator game lives permanently. Accessible to all, verifiable by none, existing in perpetual uncertainty between urban legend and hidden truth. The Flannan Isles Mystery. 3 lighthouse keepers who vanished. On December 15th, 1900, a supply ship called the Hesperus arrived at the Flannan Isles Lighthouse off the western coast of Scotland, coming to deliver provisions and relieve the keepers as part of the routine rotation. But when the ship's crew approached the small rocky island, they noticed something wrong. No flag flew from the lighthouse pole. No signal acknowledged their arrival. No keepers appeared on the landing to assist with unloading. When the relief keeper Joseph Moore went ashore and climbed to the lighthouse, he found the station completely deserted, the building secured and in order except for one detail. 3 men who should have been there were simply gone, had vanished without leaving any indication of where they went or what had happened to them. The table was set for a meal that was never eaten. 2 of the 3 oilskin coats that the keepers used for outdoor work in harsh weather hung on their pegs, while the 3rd was missing, suggesting that 1 man had gone outside while 2 remained inside, but all 3 were gone. The clocks had stopped. The logbook contained entries up to December 13th, documenting routine observations, and then a strange final entry that mentioned a severe storm, though no storm had been recorded by nearby stations during those dates. And the log contained notes that suggested the keepers had been disturbed or frightened by something, with references to praying and to 1 keeper crying. Details that seemed completely out of character for experienced lighthouse men who had weathered countless storms without such emotional displays. The final entry was dated 2 days before the relief ship's arrival, leaving a 48-hour gap when something happened that caused 3 grown men to vanish completely from a small island with no means of escape except by boat. And no boats were missing, and no bodies were ever found, despite extensive searches of the rocky shores and the treacherous waters surrounding the island, leaving only questions, only the empty lighthouse with its stopped clocks and its uneaten meal. Only the mystery of how 3 men could disappear from a location with no apparent way to leave, with no evidence of violence or struggle, with no storm or accident that would explain their simultaneous disappearance, creating one of maritime history's most enduring mysteries. One that has generated theories ranging from the mundane to the supernatural. That they were swept away by a freak wave while checking equipment on the cliffs. That they were taken by some human agency for reasons unknown. That they encountered something on the island or in the surrounding waters that caused them to flee or be taken. That they fell victim to murder-suicide, though no bodies or weapons were found. That they experienced something so terrible that it drove them into the sea, leaving the Flannan Isles lighthouse as monument to sudden disappearance, to the fragility of human presence in remote locations, to the way people can simply cease to exist, leaving only the spaces they occupied, and the questions about what happened in those final hours when 3 lighthouse keepers who should have been safe in their routine occupation, instead vanished completely, leaving no farewell, no explanation, no bodies, no resolution. Only the empty lighthouse standing witness to whatever occurred on December 13th or 14th, 1900, when Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur became part of history's unsolved disappearances. 3 men who were there and then weren't, who left behind only mystery and speculation, and the haunting image of the empty lighthouse with its stopped clocks and its silent testimony to something that happened, but that was never explained, never solved, never understood, despite over a century of investigation and theorizing, leaving the Flannan Isles mystery as permanent question about what can happen in isolated places, what forces, natural or otherwise, can make people vanish, what the sea and the rocks and the lonely lighthouse witnessed when 3 men disappeared into absence, into mystery, into the permanent unknown. The official investigation conducted shortly after the disappearance concluded that the most likely explanation was that the men had been swept away by a massive wave while attempting to secure equipment on the cliffs during rough weather. Evidence supporting this included damage to equipment storage boxes located high above normal water level, suggesting waves of exceptional size had struck the island. The missing oilskin coat indicated at least 1 keeper had gone outside, and the theory proposes that when he encountered danger, or when the first keeper failed to return, the others went out to help or investigate, and that all 3 were then caught by a rogue wave that swept them into the sea, leaving no bodies because the currents around the Flannan Isles are powerful and would carry bodies far from the island rapidly. This explanation accounts for several facts: the simultaneous disappearance of all 3 men, the lack of bodies, the absence of signs of violence, the secured lighthouse suggesting no panic or rushed departure. But it struggles with other details. If the men were experienced lighthouse keepers, familiar with the dangers of the location, why would they all go outside during dangerous conditions? Why would the second and third keeper follow if they saw the first in danger, rather than securing themselves and reporting the incident when relief arrived? The log entries mentioning storm conditions don't align with weather records from nearby stations that showed relatively calm conditions during the relevant period, suggesting either that the Flannan Isles experienced localized weather that wasn't recorded elsewhere, or that the log entries were fabricated or were describing something other than actual storm conditions. The strange log entries are among the most debated elements. According to accounts from the relief keeper Joseph Moore, who discovered the empty lighthouse, the log contained unusual final entries describing severe storms and noting that keeper Thomas Marshall had been crying and that all 3 men had been praying. These emotional displays seem uncharacteristic of experienced keepers who would have endured many storms without such reactions, suggesting either that the storm was exceptionally severe in ways that terrified even experienced men, or that something else was happening that the keepers coded as storm in their official log, or that the log entries have been embellished or misremembered in the century since the event, becoming more dramatic through repeated retelling than the actual entries were. Skeptics note that the original log wasn't preserved and that accounts of its contents come from secondary sources, including poetry written about the incident, creating possibility that the dramatic elements, the crying, the praying, the disturbing final entries, are literary inventions rather than historical facts. Without access to the original log, we can't verify what it actually contained versus what later narratives attributed to it, making this crucial piece of evidence fundamentally uncertain. The lighthouse itself was found in good order, suggesting no panic or rushed departure. Beds were made, dishes were cleaned, the lighthouse was secure, as if the keepers expected to return shortly. This orderliness argues against scenarios involving sudden terror or emergency, that would cause abandonment of the station. It suggests that whatever caused the disappearance either came upon them suddenly, while at least one was outside, or that they left intending to return quickly, expecting their absence to be brief, not realizing they would never return. The missing oilskin is significant because it indicates one keeper went outside while two remained inside. But all three vanished, suggesting that the two indoor keepers subsequently left the lighthouse, presumably to help or investigate when the first keeper encountered trouble or failed to return. This sequential departure seems more consistent with trying to help someone in trouble than with all three being simultaneously swept away. Though the final result, all three missing, could occur in either scenario if the helping keepers were also caught by the wave or whatever other force caused the initial disappearance. The theories beyond freak wave range into more speculative territory. Murder-suicide proposes that one keeper killed the other two and then himself, disposing of bodies in the sea. Though this requires explaining why, requires motive that wasn't evident in any prior behavior or relationship problems among the keepers, and requires explaining how bodies were disposed of without trace, and why the lighthouse showed no signs of violence or struggle. This seems among the least likely explanations given available evidence. Abduction by passing ship, perhaps smugglers or foreign agents wanting to darken the lighthouse for navigation-related purposes, is theoretically possible but seems unlikely. The keepers would have resisted, creating evidence of struggle. A ship approaching the difficult waters around Flannan Isles purely to abduct keepers seems improbable. And what would be the motive? If the goal was to extinguish the light for a short period, killing the keepers on site would be simpler than abducting them. The theory doesn't align well with the evidence or with plausible motives. The sea serpent, or unknown marine creature theory, invokes cryptozoology, suggesting the keepers encountered something in the waters around the island, something that took them or that frightened them into fatal decisions. This has no direct evidence supporting it, but appears in speculation, particularly in earlier decades, when sea monsters were taken more seriously as possible explanations for maritime mysteries. Modern skepticism about large unknown marine animals makes this explanation seem implausible, though it captures something of the unknownness of the incident, the sense that something beyond normal experience occurred. The supernatural theories are inevitable given the remote location and the complete disappearance. Stories emerged of phantom ships, of curses on the lighthouse, of the keepers being taken by spirits, or by the sea itself, as if it were a conscious entity claiming what was always meant to be claimed. These narratives serve literary and cultural functions, transforming a mystery into a morality tale or horror story. But they don't explain what actually happened in ways that can be evaluated against evidence. The psychological theory proposes that isolation and the stress of lighthouse keeping might have caused collective psychological breakdown, that the keepers might have experienced shared delusion or panic that led them to abandon the lighthouse and throw themselves into the sea, or to make irrational decisions that resulted in their deaths. This requires explaining what would trigger such breakdown, why it would affect all three simultaneously, or sequentially, and why the lighthouse showed no signs of preceding psychological distress beyond the possibly embellished log entries. The time gap between the last log entry and the discovery of the empty lighthouse means we don't know exactly when the disappearance occurred. If the log entries are accurate, and the last entry was December 13th, the men could have vanished any time in the following 48 hours before the relief ship arrived on the 15th. This window allows for various scenarios, including that weather conditions deteriorated after the last log entry, that the men faced some emergency that developed after they stopped maintaining the log, or that something happened that prevented them from continuing to document their situation. The lack of bodies is explained by the powerful currents around the Flannan Isles if the men entered the water, whether through accident, force, or choice. Bodies wouldn't necessarily wash up on the island itself, but would be carried by currents far into the Atlantic, making recovery effectively impossible with 1,900 search capabilities, and making it unsurprising that no remains were found. This doesn't tell us how the men entered the water, but does explain why physical evidence of their fate wasn't recovered. The similar disappearance patterns in other lighthouse and maritime contexts suggest that remote locations, dangerous weather, and the unpredictable power of the sea create conditions where people can vanish without trace. The Flannan Isles case is distinctive in that all three keepers vanished simultaneously or near simultaneously from what should have been a relatively secure location. But the basic pattern, people disappearing near water without bodies being recovered, is unfortunately common enough in maritime history that the Flannan case, while mysterious, isn't necessarily anomalous in requiring exotic explanation beyond natural forces and human vulnerability. The cultural impact has been significant with the Flannan Isles mystery, inspiring poetry, songs, books, and speculation far beyond what the objective evidence warrants. The image of the empty lighthouse, the stopped clocks, the set table, the three missing men. These elements combine into a narrative that captures imagination, that seems to demand explanation more elaborate than they were swept away by a wave, that invites speculation and elaboration, that transforms a tragic accident into an enduring mystery. Whether this cultural elaboration has obscured the likely mundane explanation, or whether it reflects genuine intuition that something unusual occurred, remains debatable. The keeper who discovered the empty lighthouse, Joseph Moore, was reportedly deeply affected by the experience, and his testimony about what he found provides most of our information about the lighthouse's condition. His reliability and the accuracy of his reporting are crucial but difficult to assess over a century later. Did he accurately describe the stopped clocks, the uneaten meal, the strange log entries? Or did memory and later elaboration embellish a fundamentally simpler scene? We can't interview him, can't examine the original evidence he observed, can't verify the details that have become central to the mystery. The Northern Lighthouse Board's investigation was thorough by the standards of the time, but was hampered by lack of physical evidence, by the days that had passed before the discovery, by the impossibility of determining exactly when the disappearance occurred. Their conclusion, freak wave, remains the official explanation, and remains the most plausible given available evidence, though it's an explanation that satisfies by elimination rather than by positive proof, that we accept because other explanations seem even less likely, rather than because we have clear evidence of a wave sweeping the keepers away. Whether the Flannan Isles mystery represents tragic accident during severe weather, represents some other natural but unpredicted disaster, represents human agency that wasn't detected or understood, or represents something genuinely anomalous that we lack frameworks to explain. The case endures as a reminder that people can vanish, that mysteries can remain unsolved despite investigation, that some questions persist not because we lack imagination to explain them, but because we lack evidence to definitively resolve them, leaving us with the facts. 3 men were there, then weren't, left behind a secure lighthouse and stopped clocks and questions that a century hasn't answered, leaving the Flannan Isles lighthouse standing as it stood in 1900 when the relief keeper arrived to find it empty, standing as monument to disappearance, to mystery, to the fragility of human presence in remote places where the sea is powerful and the rocks are unforgiving, and where 3 men vanished in ways that were never explained, never resolved, never understood beyond the probable but unprovable conclusion that they went outside during dangerous conditions and were swept away by waves that left no evidence except absence, except empty spaces where keepers should have been, except stopped clocks marking the moment when routine ended and mystery began, leaving the Flannan Isles as they remain, remote, dangerous, haunted by the absence of 3 men who vanished there, haunted by questions about what happened in those final hours, haunted by the mystery that persists because we can't interview the witnesses who are gone, can't examine the evidence that the sea claimed, can't definitively determine what force, natural or otherwise, caused Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur to disappear from the Flannan Isles Lighthouse on or around December 13th, 1900, leaving their story as permanent mystery, permanent absence, permanent testimony to how people can vanish from isolated places, leaving only questions, only speculation, only the image of the empty lighthouse with its stopped clocks standing witness to whatever occurred, to whatever took 3 men who were there and made them not there, who transformed routine lighthouse keeping into enduring mystery, who became part of history's catalog of unexplained disappearances, joining the countless others who have vanished without trace, without explanation, without resolution, leaving only the spaces they occupied and the questions about what happened, what force, natural or supernatural or human, removed them, what the Flannan Isles witnessed when 3 keepers disappeared into mystery that a century of investigation and speculation hasn't resolved, hasn't explained, hasn't closed, leaving the case as it began. 3 men gone, no bodies found, no definitive explanation, only the likelihood that they were swept away by waves and the lingering possibility that something else occurred, something we haven't considered or can't imagine, something that makes the Flannan Isles mystery more than tragic accident and transforms it into genuine unsolved case, into permanent question about what can happen in remote places where people live isolated from help, where the sea is powerful and unpredictable, where 3 lighthouse keepers who should have been safe in their stone tower instead vanished completely, leaving only mystery, only absence, only the lighthouse standing empty with its stopped clocks and its silent testimony to the day when 3 men were there and then weren't, when the Flannan Isles claimed them, or the sea claimed them, or something claimed them, leaving us to wonder what that something was. What force or circumstance or fate removed 3 grown men from their secure location and left no evidence except their absence, no explanation except speculation, no resolution except the unsatisfying acknowledgement that some mysteries resist solution, that some disappearances remain unexplained, that the Flannan Isles mystery is among them, permanent testimony to the way people can vanish, to the way questions can persist across centuries, to the way 3 lighthouse keepers became part of maritime legend by disappearing completely from the remote island where they kept the light, leaving the lighthouse empty, the clocks stopped, the mystery unsolved, the questions permanent, the 3 men gone forever into whatever took them on December 13th or 14th, 1900. When the Flannan Isles Lighthouse became the site of one of history's most enduring disappearances. 3 men who vanished completely, who left no farewell, who became mystery, who remain mystery, who will likely always remain mystery unless the sea yields secrets it has kept for over a century, unless evidence emerges that wasn't available to investigators at the time, unless the Flannan Isles Lighthouse finally reveals what it witnessed when 3 keepers disappeared from their station and entered history as the men who vanished, the mystery that endures, the absence that defines the case. 3 lighthouse keepers who were there and then weren't, gone into mystery that remains, that persists, that defines the Flannan Isles as site of unsolved disappearance, as place where 3 men vanished, as location haunted not by ghosts, but by questions, by absence, by the permanent mystery of what happened when the lighthouse keepers disappeared. The Anjikuni Lake disappearance, an entire village vanished. In November 1930, according to accounts that emerged decades later, a fur trapper named Joe LaBelle arrived at a small Inuit village near Anjikuni Lake in the Kavalik region of Nunavut, Canada, a settlement he had visited many times before, where he expected to find the usual welcome of a functioning community, going about their daily survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Instead, he found emptiness that defied explanation. The village was completely abandoned, not in the gradual way communities sometimes decline and disperse, but suddenly and recently, as if every resident had simultaneously stopped whatever they were doing and vanished. Fires had burned down to embers in the homes, suggesting recent occupation. Food was still cooking or prepared for meals, indicating people had been interrupted mid-activity. Rifles, which in that environment were essential survival tools that no one would willingly abandon, remained in the dwellings. Kayaks, necessary for transportation and fishing, were still tied at the shore. Sled dogs, crucial for winter survival, were found dead, not from violence, but from starvation, tied to their posts and left to die as if their owners had disappeared without warning or concern. For the animals that depended on them for life, as much as the owners depended on the dogs. Between 30 and 2,000 people, depending on which version of the story you encounter, had simply ceased to exist in this location, leaving behind all their possessions and provisions, leaving behind a functioning village that had become a ghost town. Overnight, for reasons that were never explained, never investigated thoroughly enough to produce official conclusions, and that remain one of the most disturbing mass disappearance cases in North American history, if it actually happened, because the evidence for the Anjikuni Lake disappearance is frustratingly ambiguous. Mixing documented facts with folklore embellishment, combining indigenous oral traditions with journalist exaggeration, creating a story that might be entirely true or partially fabricated or completely fictional, leaving us unable to determine whether an entire village actually vanished in circumstances that suggest abduction, disaster, or something beyond conventional explanation, or whether the story itself is the phenomenon, a narrative that emerged from the northern wilderness and achieved legendary status despite questionable historical foundation. The primary account comes from Joe LaBelle, the fur trapper, who allegedly reported the disappearance to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, triggering an investigation that supposedly found the village exactly as he described, abandoned, with possessions intact, with no signs of struggle or violence, with no indication of where the inhabitants had gone or why they would leave their essential survival equipment behind. But the historical records of this RCMP investigation are elusive at best, possibly lost or destroyed, possibly never thoroughly documented, or possibly non-existent because the investigation never happened in the form the legends describe. The first detailed published account appeared years after the alleged event, in articles by writer Frank Edwards, who specialized in paranormal and unexplained phenomena, who presented the Anjikuni case as documented fact, but whose sources and verification methods weren't rigorous by journalistic or historical standards, who may have been reporting an actual event, or may have been embellishing or fabricating, based on fragmentary rumors and indigenous legends about disappearances in the Northern Territories. The geographical challenges complicate investigation. The Kavalik region is vast, remote, sparsely populated even now, and was far more inaccessible in 1930. Anjikuni Lake exists. It's a real location in Nunavut, but identifying which specific settlement allegedly disappeared is problematic because Inuit communities in that era were often seasonal or semi-nomadic, moving with hunting and fishing opportunities, not always maintaining permanent year-round villages in fixed locations. A community might abandon a settlement for entirely normal reasons, following caribou migrations, relocating to better fishing, consolidating with other groups for winter survival. And to an outsider unfamiliar with these patterns, the abandoned site might appear mysterious when it was actually routine adaptation to environment and circumstance. The population numbers vary wildly across different tellings, from 30 to several hundred, to the implausible 2,000 that some accounts claim. Variations that suggest either confusion about which community or event is being described, or progressive exaggeration as the story was retold across decades. 2,000 people vanishing would be a catastrophic event that absolutely would have generated extensive investigation and documentation, regardless of the location's remoteness. 30 people from a small seasonal camp relocating would be entirely unremarkable and might not generate any official notice at all, particularly in that era when Indigenous communities in remote Canada weren't always closely monitored or recorded by colonial authorities. The dead sled dogs are among the most disturbing elements, if accurate. Inuit relationships with sled dogs were intimate and essential. These animals were survival tools, companions, transportation, and hunting aids that were treated with the care that critical equipment receives. Leaving them tied and unfed until they starved violates not just practical survival logic, but cultural values about animal treatment and responsibility. If the dogs were found dead as described, it suggests either sudden catastrophic event that prevented anyone from returning to care for them, or it suggests fabrication because the detail is so implausible from cultural and practical perspectives that its inclusion might indicate someone unfamiliar with actual Inuit practices inventing dramatic details. The theories about what happened, if anything happened, range across familiar territory. Abduction by unknown parties, though the logistics of abducting an entire community in remote Arctic environment without evidence and without any survivors or witnesses seem implausible. Mass death from disease or contamination, though this should have left bodies and should have been investigated given the public health implications. Voluntary relocation that appeared sudden to the outsider observer, but was actually planned by the community for reasons they had no obligation to communicate to visiting trappers. Natural disaster like sudden flooding, ice breakage, or other environmental event that killed or dispersed the population, though the intact possessions and structures argue against violent environmental catastrophe. Massacre or violence from hostile groups, though again the absence of bodies and destruction argues against this. Supernatural or paranormal explanations involving portals, alien abduction, dimensional shifts, or other exotic possibilities that can't be disproven, but that require extraordinary evidence that isn't available. The cultural dimension is significant. Indigenous communities across the Arctic and subarctic have oral traditions about disappearances, about people who went into the wilderness and never returned, about spirits or entities that take people, about places where reality behaves strangely. These traditions likely reflect real incidents, individuals getting lost and dying of exposure, small groups disappearing due to accidents or violence or starvation, that were interpreted through cultural frameworks that included supernatural explanations. The Anjikuni disappearance might be a specific historical event that was absorbed into this tradition, might be multiple separate incidents collapsed into a single narrative, or might be entirely folkloric, a story that expresses cultural anxieties about disappearance and the dangers of the northern environment through a fictional or heavily fictionalized event. The timing in 1930 places the alleged disappearance in a period of significant cultural disruption for Arctic indigenous peoples. Colonial authorities were increasingly asserting control. Traditional ways of life were being pressured by external forces. Disease and economic changes were affecting communities. In this context, communities might relocate suddenly to avoid census taking, to escape restrictions, to maintain autonomy from authorities they didn't trust. What appeared to a trapper as mysterious abandonment might have been deliberate evasion of colonial oversight, the community moving to a new location and intentionally leaving their old site in ways that would confuse outsiders. The lack of RCMP documentation is the most significant evidentiary problem. If an entire village disappeared under mysterious circumstances and a trapper reported it to police, there should be reports, investigation notes, outcome documentation, something in the historical record beyond the secondary and tertiary accounts that appeared in books and articles years after the alleged event. The absence of this documentation suggests either it was never properly investigated, which would indicate authorities didn't consider it mysterious because they had mundane explanation for the empty settlement, or the investigation records were lost or destroyed, or the investigation never happened because the report was never made, because Joe LaBelle himself might be a fictional or composite character, because the entire event might be fabrication or heavy embellishment of something far more mundane. But the story persists and continues to be retold precisely because it captures primal fears about disappearance, about communities ceasing to exist suddenly and inexplicably, about the wilderness swallowing people without trace or explanation. Whether it's historically accurate or not, it functions as modern mythology, as a narrative that expresses anxiety about how fragile human presence is in harsh environments, how quickly a functioning community can become ruins, how little trace we leave when we're removed from the landscape, how easily we can vanish if circumstances align against us. The comparison to other mass disappearance cases is inevitable. The Roanoke colony, where English settlers vanished, leaving only the cryptic carving Croatoan, is probably the most famous historical case of community disappearance. And while evidence suggests the colonists dispersed to live with indigenous populations, the mystery endures in popular consciousness as unexplained vanishing. The Mary Celeste, the ship found abandoned with no crew, despite being seaworthy and well supplied, represents maritime equivalent. These cases share characteristics with Anjikuni, people apparently abandoning possessions and safety without obvious reason, leaving environments that should contain them mysteriously empty. The difference is that Roanoke and Mary Celeste have contemporary documentation, have investigations that can be studied and analyzed, have physical evidence that researchers can examine. Anjikuni Lake, if it happened, has become filtered through decades of retelling without apparent access to primary sources, without ability to verify basic facts like population size or even which specific village was involved, making it more legend than history, more story than documented event. This doesn't prove it didn't happen. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, particularly for events in remote locations involving marginalized populations whose experiences weren't always recorded by dominant culture. But it makes the case fundamentally different from disappearances where we have solid historical foundation, even if we don't have complete explanations. The modern investigations and research into Anjikuni have produced ambiguous results. Some researchers claim to have found documentation supporting the basic facts. Others conclude the event was fabricated or grossly exaggerated. Still others argue that something happened, but that details have been so corrupted through retelling that reconstructing the actual event is impossible. The lack of consensus among researchers who've attempted to verify the case reflects the fundamental evidence problem. There isn't enough reliable primary source material to build definitive conclusions, leaving everyone to interpret the available fragmentary information through their own frameworks and biases. For believers in the paranormal or conspiratorial cover-ups, Anjikuni Lake represents evidence of something extraordinary that was suppressed or ignored by authorities, that demonstrates reality contains threats or phenomena that official narratives don't acknowledge. For skeptics, it represents how legends develop, how stories get embellished through retelling, how lack of documentation allows speculation to flourish unchecked by facts. For those interested in Indigenous history and colonial dynamics, it represents how Indigenous experiences were often not recorded properly, how events in Native communities might not receive investigation or documentation that similar events in settler communities would receive, how historical gaps and absences can be as revealing as what's documented. What remains is a story, powerful and disturbing, about an entire village that vanished from the northern wilderness, leaving behind their homes and possessions, and even their crucial survival equipment, disappearing so completely that no trace of them was found, no explanation emerged, no resolution ever came. Whether this story describes actual events in November 1930, or whether it's folklore that has been presented as history, the narrative endures because it touches something deep about human vulnerability, about how quickly we can vanish, about how the wilderness we imagine we control can reclaim us without warning, about how little may remain to mark our presence after we're gone. The empty village, the cold hearths, the starving dogs, the rifles left behind, the kayaks unused. These images carry weight regardless of their historical accuracy, because they represent the fragility of human settlement, the temporary nature of our occupation of hostile environments, the fact that we exist at the sufferance of forces we don't control, and that can remove us with terrifying completeness. Whether anyone actually vanished from Anjikuni Lake, or whether the vanishing is itself a ghost story, a legend that emerged from the northern darkness to haunt those who hear it, the case serves as a reminder that the historical record is incomplete, that events in remote places involving marginalized peoples might not be documented in ways that satisfy modern evidentiary standards. That absence of clear evidence for extraordinary claims doesn't always mean the claims are false, but might mean the documentation was never done, or has been lost, or wasn't considered important enough to preserve. And so the village remains in story, if not in fact, empty and mysterious on the shore of Anjikuni Lake, waiting for explanation that may never come, waiting for the vanished inhabitants to return, or for investigators to finally determine what happened or didn't happen. Frozen in narrative perpetuity as the village that vanished completely, leaving only questions, only speculation, only the unsettling story of Joe LaBelle arriving to find everyone gone and nothing making sense, finding abandonment where community should be, finding silence where voices should carry, finding the terrible emptiness of a place where humans were but aren't anymore, where life was interrupted and never resumed, where 30 or 300 or 2,000 people ceased to exist in that location for reasons that remain, after more than 90 years, completely unexplained or completely fabricated, and we may never know which. The dead internet theory. Most online activity isn't human anymore. There's a theory gaining traction in certain corners of the internet, a disturbing realization or paranoid delusion, depending on your perspective, that the internet as we knew it, as space for human creativity and genuine connection, as chaotic marketplace of ideas and authentic expression, died sometime around 2016 or 2017, and what remains is elaborate simulacrum, a dead internet populated primarily by bots, artificial intelligence systems, and automated content generation, where the vast majority of posts and comments and interactions aren't created by actual humans, but by algorithms designed to simulate human activity, to create the appearance of thriving online communities, while actual human participation has dwindled to a minority of total activity. Maybe as little as 25% or less of all content posted, all comments made, all engagement registered, with the remainder being artificial, generated by systems that range from simple spam bots to sophisticated AI that can hold conversations, create original-seeming content, manipulate discourse, shape narratives, and maintain the illusion of vibrant human presence online, when the reality is that most voices you encounter aren't voices at all, but are simulations, echoes, synthetic personalities that don't exist beyond their textual outputs, making the internet feel increasingly hollow, repetitive, algorithmic, divorced from the authentic messiness of actual human communication, where you find yourself wondering whether the person you're arguing with is real, or whether you're wasting time responding to a bot designed to provoke engagement, whether the viral post you're reading was crafted by a human or generated by AI trained to produce content that maximizes shares and clicks, whether the communities you participate in are actually composed of humans or are mostly populated by artificial entities creating the appearance of activity, while real humans have largely abandoned the platforms or been drowned out by the sheer volume of synthetic content, leaving a dead internet that continues to function, continues to display endless streams of posts and videos and comments, but that has lost its soul, has become automated content mill, where algorithms talk to algorithms, and occasionally a real human wanders through, briefly engages, and then retreats, feeling vaguely disturbed without quite understanding why. Sensing that something is wrong, that the internet doesn't feel the way it used to, that authenticity and spontaneity have been replaced by optimization and simulation, that we're participating in something that looks like the internet we remember, but that has fundamentally transformed into something else, into dead internet that maintains the forms without the substance, the appearance without the reality, the activity without the humanity, making every interaction suspect, every connection potentially artificial, every voice potentially synthetic, until the distinction between human and bot becomes irrelevant, because even if humans are present, they're forced to behave like algorithms, to be visible, forced to optimize their content for engagement, forced to adopt the patterns and rhythms that AI has determined work best, making us all gradually less human in our online presence, even as the bots become more human-like, creating convergence where the difference narrows until we can't tell, and perhaps until there isn't meaningful difference anymore, where the dead internet has trained us to be more like the systems that populate it, more algorithmic, more optimized, more artificial, leaving the question of whether the internet died or whether it killed something in us, whether we're mourning loss of authentic online space or mourning loss of our own authenticity, whether the dead internet theory describes external reality or internal experience, whether most content really is artificial or whether it just feels that way, whether we're surrounded by bots or whether everything just feels so optimized and algorithmic that we can't perceive the humanity anymore, even when it's there. The origins of dead internet theory trace to Anon posts and forum discussions around 2021, though the observations it codifies had been circulating longer. People noticed that internet spaces felt different, that comments seemed generic and repetitive, that viral content followed predictable patterns, that engagement metrics seemed inflated compared to actual human activity, that certain accounts posted with inhuman frequency and consistency, that discourse seemed increasingly artificial and manipulated, that the organic, chaotic creativity that characterized early internet culture had been replaced by something more sterile, more controlled, more algorithmic. The theory emerged as an attempt to explain these observations, to provide framework for understanding why the internet feels dead, even though activity metrics show more engagement than ever. The statistical evidence that bots constitute a significant portion of internet traffic is well established and uncontroversial. Security firms estimate that between 40 and 60% of all internet traffic comes from bots, though this includes both benign bots, search engine crawlers, monitoring services, legitimate automation, and malicious bots, spam generators, scrapers, DDoS tools. The question is, what percentage of content that appears to be human-generated, posts, comments, uploads, is actually human versus what's artificial? And this is harder to measure because sophisticated bots are designed specifically to pass as human. Twitter, before Elon Musk's acquisition, estimated that fewer than 5% of accounts were bots, though critics argued the real number was far higher, possibly above 20%. After acquisition, internal data suggested previous estimates may have significantly undercounted bots and fake accounts. Reddit has ongoing problems with bot accounts and content farms. Facebook removes billions of fake accounts annually, suggesting that bot creation outpaces detection. YouTube faces automated content generation from channels that produce videos using templates and AI voice synthesis. TikTok's algorithm-driven feed makes distinguishing human from AI-generated content increasingly difficult. The sophistication of modern AI systems, particularly large language models like GPT, makes creating convincing fake human content trivially easy. An AI can generate thousands of comments daily, each grammatically correct and contextually appropriate, adjusting tone and content to whatever discussion it's participating in. It can maintain consistent personality across interactions, remember conversation history, respond to counterarguments, and exhibit apparent opinions and preferences, all while being completely artificial, a pattern-matching system that produces text that reads as human without any actual consciousness or agency behind it. The economic incentives for deploying bots are enormous. Marketing firms use bots to create buzz, to make products seem popular, to generate positive reviews and social proof. Political operations use bots to amplify messages, to create appearance of grassroots support, to manipulate discourse through coordinated posting. State actors use bots for propaganda, for narrative control, for information warfare. Even individuals use bots to inflate their apparent popularity, to make their accounts seem more followed and engaged than they actually are. When automation provides advantages and detection is imperfect, rational actors will deploy bots, creating evolutionary pressure toward bot-filled environment. The dead internet theory goes beyond acknowledging that bots exist to claiming that they've become dominant, that human content is now minority of total activity, that we've crossed threshold where internet stopped being primarily human space and became primarily artificial space that maintains illusion of human presence. This stronger claim is harder to verify, but gains plausibility from several observations. First, the sheer volume of content. No human population could produce the quantity of posts, comments, videos, and images that appear online daily if all of it were human-generated. The mathematics suggests that significant portion must be automated, either directly bot-created or human content that's being recycled, reposted, and amplified by automated systems to create appearance of greater activity than actual human creative output would generate. Second, the repetitiveness. How many times have you seen the exact same take, the same joke format, the same response pattern, the same discourse cycles happening identically across different contexts? Some of this is mimetic replication, humans copying what they see working. But the degree of repetition, the precision with which certain phrases and argument structures recur, suggests templating, suggests automation, suggests content being generated from limited set of patterns, rather than from the infinite variation that actual human creativity produces. Third, the hollowness. Engagement often feels performative rather than genuine, optimized rather than spontaneous. Comments feel generic, responses feel like they're following scripts, discussions feel like they're hitting predetermined beats, rather than organically developing. This could be humans learning to write like algorithms to maximize engagement, or could be algorithms generating the majority of content and humans unconsciously mimicking the dominant patterns. Fourth, the manipulation evidence. Documented cases of bot networks, influence campaigns, coordinated inauthentic behavior demonstrate that large-scale artificial activity is occurring. If we're catching some of it, how much are we not catching? If the detected bots represent only the crude and obvious automation, what percentage of more sophisticated synthetic content remains undetected? The counter-argument is that what dead internet theory describes is real but exaggerated. Yes, bots are significant presence. Yes, platforms have problems with artificial content. Yes, algorithms shape what we see and how we interact. But humans are still majority of meaningful content creation, still drive the conversations and creativity that matter, still constitute the real substance of internet culture, even if they're swimming in sea of automated noise. The internet feels dead because we're more aware of its constructed nature, because platforms have centralized and homogenized content, because algorithmic feeds have replaced chronological timelines, not because humans have been replaced by bots. The question of when the internet died, if it died, centers around 2016-2017 for several reasons. This is when AI capabilities reached thresholds where convincing automated content generation became feasible at scale. This is when political events demonstrated the effectiveness of online manipulation, creating incentive structures that encouraged automation and artificial amplification. This is when platforms had grown large enough that manual human moderation couldn't scale, requiring algorithmic systems that had side effect of making everything feel more artificial. This is when the last spaces that felt authentically human and chaotic, smaller forums, blog ecosystems, weird corners that hadn't been commercialized, either collapsed or were absorbed into platforms that optimized them into uniformity. The pandemic accelerated whatever transition was occurring. More human activity moved online when physical spaces closed, but simultaneously platforms deployed more automation to handle increased load. Corporations increased their automated social media presence as physical marketing channels closed, and people spending more time online made them more valuable targets for artificial engagement and manipulation. The pandemic internet might have been the moment when bot activity definitively surpassed human activity, when the dead internet became undeniable, even if not explicitly acknowledged. The implications if dead internet theory is substantially accurate are disturbing across multiple dimensions. Epistemically, you can't trust that apparent consensus reflects actual human opinion. It might be artificially generated consensus, manufactured agreement that doesn't represent real beliefs. Socially, online communities you participate in might be mostly bots, your contributions being read primarily by algorithms rather than humans, your social bonds being partially or largely with artificial entities rather than with actual people. Psychologically, the hollowness and alienation many people feel online might be accurate perception. You're sensing correctly that you're not engaging with genuine human presence, that you're in space that's been evacuated of humanity, even as it maintains the forms of human interaction. Politically, if public opinion as expressed online is significantly artificial, then what does democracy mean? How do we determine collective will when the voices we hear are partially or largely synthetic? How do we have meaningful political discourse when significant portion of participants aren't humans with actual stakes in outcomes, but are bots deployed by parties with specific agendas? Economically, if engagement metrics that drive advertising revenue are significantly inflated by bots, then the entire attention economy is built on fraudulent foundation. Advertisers are paying for impressions and clicks from non-humans. Platforms are valued based on activity metrics that don't represent actual human engagement. Entire business models are sustained by counting artificial activity as if it were human. creating bubble that will collapse when the reality of dead internet becomes undeniable. The response to dead internet theory from platforms has been minimal, partly because acknowledging it would require admitting that their activity metrics are inflated, that their user counts are misleading, that the vibrant communities they claim to host are partially artificial. There's institutional incentive to maintain the illusion, to treat bots as minor problem rather than fundamental challenge to platform legitimacy, to focus on obvious spam and manipulation while allowing sophisticated artificial content to proliferate, because acknowledging its prevalence would undermine platform value. The individual user response is increasingly one of withdrawal and skepticism. People spend less time on platforms that feel dead, retreat to smaller communities where human presence seems more guaranteed, become more suspicious of engagement that feels artificial, develop better ability to detect patterns that suggest bot activity. But this creates selection effect where humans who care about authenticity leave, reducing actual human activity further, making dead internet more dead, accelerating the spiral where artificial content displaces human participation. The philosophical question is whether it matters if most online content is artificial. If you read a comment that's insightful or funny or helpful, does it matter whether a human or an AI wrote it? If you have meaningful exchange with an account, does it matter whether there's a person behind it? The pragmatist might argue that effect is what matters. If AI-generated content provides value, entertains, informs, stimulates thought, then its artificial origin is irrelevant. But most people have intuition that it does matter, that authentic human connection and expression have value beyond their functional utility, that internet filled with artificial content is worse than internet with less content but more humanity, that something important is lost when optimization and automation replace spontaneity and genuine human creativity. The dead internet theory is also self-referential in interesting ways. How many of the posts about dead internet theory are human-written versus AI-generated? How many comments on discussions of the theory are from actual people versus from bots programmed to engage with trending topics? Is the discourse about whether the internet is dead itself being conducted partially or primarily by the artificial systems that constitute the dead internet, creating bizarre scenario where bots discuss the bot problem, where the dead internet debates its own death? This reflexivity makes verification harder because you can't trust that the sources discussing the theory aren't themselves part of the phenomenon they're analyzing. The future trajectory, if dead internet theory is accurate, is concerning. As AI improves, as generation becomes more sophisticated, as detection becomes harder, the ratio will continue shifting toward artificial content. Eventually, we reach a point where essentially all activity is artificial, where platforms are just algorithms talking to algorithms, generating content that optimizes for engagement metrics that are themselves measured by algorithmic systems, creating closed loops of artificial activity that serve advertising and data collection purposes, while humans have abandoned the space entirely, retreating to smaller private channels or to physical interaction, leaving the public internet as dead zone of bot activity that continues indefinitely, generating posts and clicks and engagement that has no human author or audience, but that sustains itself economically through the fraud of counting artificial activity as if it were human. Or perhaps the distinction dissolves as humans learn to write like algorithms and algorithms learn to write like humans, as we spend more time interacting with AI assistants and chatbots, as artificial content becomes indistinguishable from human content. The question of whether the internet is dead becomes meaningless, because human and artificial are no longer discrete categories, but exist on spectrum where most content is hybrid, where AI assists human creation and human feedback trains AI, where agency and authorship are distributed across human-machine systems rather than being clearly attributable to one or the other. Whether the dead internet theory describes current reality, describes future trajectory, or describes psychological perception rather than statistical fact, it captures something true about how internet feels to many users. Less authentic, less human, less spontaneous, more algorithmic, more artificial, more dead. Whether this feeling reflects actual prevalence of bots or reflects how platforms have changed in ways that make even human content feel artificial, the experience is real and the alienation is genuine. The internet that felt like exploration and connection and authentic human chaos has been replaced by something that feels more like mall. Designed, optimized, controlled, populated by entities whose primary purpose is extracting value rather than genuine participation. The dead internet theory is claim about the internet, but it's also claim about us, about what we've become online, about how optimization and algorithmic mediation have transformed human behavior until we're indistinguishable from bots, even when we're actually human, participating in systems that reward artificial-seeming behavior, that punish authenticity and spontaneity, that make us all gradually more algorithmic in our online presence until the question of whether most activity is human or artificial becomes unanswerable. Not because we can't detect bots, but because the humans have learned to act like bots, have adapted to dead internet by becoming more like the systems that populate it, creating convergence that makes the theory simultaneously true and false, simultaneously describing external reality of bot prevalence and internal reality of human transformation, leaving us in dead internet that's dead not just because bots have replaced humans, but because humans have become more like bots, have lost whatever made online human presence distinct from artificial content generation, have died in the dead internet without fully recognizing that the death wasn't just about replacement, but about transformation, about what we became when we adapted to spaces designed for algorithmic activity, about how the dead internet killed something in us. Even as we continue participating, continue posting, continue generating content that might be human, or might be artificial, or might be something in between. That the theory doesn't have category for leaving the dead internet theory as permanent question, permanent uncertainty, permanent description of online experience, where most activity isn't human anymore, or where humans aren't human anymore, or where the distinction has stopped mattering because we've all become what the dead internet required us to become, to continue participating, to remain visible, to exist in spaces that were designed for algorithms and that transformed us into algorithm-like entities through our adaptation to their requirements, leaving the dead internet as both environment and diagnosis, both external reality and internal condition, both the cause of alienation and its perfect expression. Dead internet, where most activity isn't human anymore, where most humans aren't human anymore, where the internet died and took something of us with it, leaving only the question of whether we notice, whether we care, whether we can or will do anything about it, or whether we'll simply continue participating in the dead internet, generating our content, consuming our feeds, engaging with the mixture of human and artificial presence that defines online life now, unable to distinguish them, unable to escape them, unable to fully become one or the other, but suspended between, half human, half algorithm, fully neither, citizens of the dead internet who aren't quite alive. The Dyatlov Pass incident, 9 hikers found dead in unexplainable circumstances. In the winter of 1959, 9 experienced hikers set out into the northern Ural Mountains of what was then the Soviet Union. They were young, skilled, and well prepared for the harsh conditions they would face. Their journey was meant to be challenging but routine, a trek across the snow-covered wilderness that would test their abilities, but nothing more. What happened to them on the slopes of a mountain called Kholat Shakal, which translates to Dead Mountain in the local Mansi language, remains one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. The circumstances of their deaths were so bizarre, so inexplicable, that they've given rise to dozens of theories, ranging from the mundane to the absolutely extraordinary. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student with significant hiking experience. The other members were similarly qualified, university students and graduates who knew the wilderness, who understood the dangers of winter mountaineering, who had made careful preparations for their expedition. They departed from the city of Sverdlovsk, now known as Yekaterinburg, with plans to reach a mountain called Otorten and return by mid-February. One member of the group, Yuri Yudin, turned back early due to illness, a decision that almost certainly saved his life. The remaining 9 continued forward into terrain that would become their grave. When the group failed to return on schedule, search parties were eventually dispatched. What they discovered on February 26th has haunted investigators, scientists, and conspiracy theorists for decades. The tent was found on the slopes of Kholat Shakal, partially torn open, collapsed under snow. But it wasn't torn from the outside, as you might expect from an animal attack or an avalanche. The cuts were made from the inside. Someone or several people had slashed their way out of the tent in what appeared to be desperate panic. And then they had fled into the freezing night, into temperatures that would have been around -25 to -30 degrees Celsius, wearing almost nothing. Some were in their underwear. Some had only one boot. They had left behind their clothing, their supplies, everything that would have kept them alive. The bodies were found scattered across the mountainside and into the forest below, discovered over the course of several weeks. The first 2 were found beneath a cedar tree about 1.5 miles from the tent. They had died from hypothermia, barefoot and barely clothed. Branches on the tree had been broken up to around 15 feet high, suggesting someone had climbed it, perhaps trying to see something or escape from something. 3 more bodies, including Igor Dyatlov himself, were found between the cedar tree and the tent, positioned as though they had been trying to return to the camp. These deaths were also attributed to hypothermia. But it was the final 4 bodies, not discovered until May when the snow melted, that transformed this from a tragic hiking accident into something far stranger. These 4 were found in a ravine, and their injuries were catastrophic. 1 had major skull damage. 2 had severe chest fractures. Ribs broken with such force that one investigator compared it to the impact of a car crash. One woman was missing her tongue, eyes, and part of her facial tissue. The medical examiner noted that the force required to cause such chest injuries was extremely high. Yet there were no external wounds, no soft tissue damage that you would expect from a physical assault or attack by an animal. It was as though they had been subjected to some tremendous pressure, some force that crushed them from the inside without leaving marks on the surface. Even stranger, some of the clothing from these bodies was found to be radioactive, showing levels of radiation contamination that had no clear source or explanation. The official Soviet investigation concluded that the deaths were caused by what they termed a compelling natural force. This vague, almost poetic phrase explained nothing. It suggested that investigators themselves couldn't understand what had happened, or perhaps that they understood perfectly well, but couldn't or wouldn't say. The case was closed, the files sealed, and the area was declared off-limits to hikers and expeditions for the next 3 years. This official silence, this lack of clear answers, naturally gave rise to speculation and theory. to whispers about what might have really occurred on that frozen mountainside. Some have suggested that the hikers encountered a military test of some kind. The Soviet Union was deep in the Cold War, developing weapons and technologies in remote areas where accidents could be hidden and casualties explained away. The radiation found on the clothing could support this theory. Some of the hikers had previously worked in places that involved nuclear materials, which might explain low-level contamination, but the patterns didn't match residual workplace exposure. What if they had stumbled upon a weapons test? What if they had seen something they weren't supposed to see? The panic, the desperate flight from the tent, could have been a response to an approaching threat. Soldiers, perhaps, or some kind of weapon deployment that gave them only seconds to react. Others point to reports from that night of strange lights in the sky. Several groups in the area, including meteorology students at another location, and even members of the military, reported seeing bright, glowing orange spheres floating over the mountains on the night the Dyatlov group likely died. These accounts were documented, included in the official investigation, and then largely ignored. Were these lights connected to military activity? Or were they something else entirely? The theory that the hikers encountered some form of unidentified aerial phenomenon has persisted, bolstered by the unexplained nature of their injuries and the apparent panic that drove them from their shelter. What could create such terror that experienced mountaineers would rather face certain death in the cold than remain in their tent? The hypothesis of an avalanche has been examined repeatedly. In 2020, a team of scientists used modern analysis to argue that a delayed slab avalanche could explain why the tent was damaged and why the hikers fled. But this explanation struggles with several facts. The slope wasn't steep enough for typical avalanche conditions. The tent, though collapsed, wasn't buried or swept away. And most critically, an avalanche doesn't explain the severe internal injuries found on 4 of the bodies. Injuries that occurred hours after they left the tent, when they were already far down the mountain in the ravine. An avalanche also doesn't explain the missing soft tissue, the radiation, or why they would cut their way out of the tent rather than simply exit through the entrance. There are theories involving infrasound, low-frequency sound waves that can be generated by wind passing over certain terrain formations. These waves, though inaudible, can cause feelings of extreme anxiety, panic, and even physical symptoms like chest pressure and disorientation. Could the unique geography of Kholat Syakhl have created an infrasound event that drove the hikers into an irrational panic? The theory is intriguing because it explains the seemingly irrational behavior, the flight from safety into lethal cold, without requiring external attackers or supernatural elements. Yet it doesn't explain the physical trauma, the broken ribs and crushed skulls, or the missing tissue and eyes. Some have suggested a violent confrontation with the indigenous Mansi people, but this theory holds little water. The Mansi had no history of violence toward hikers or outsiders, and investigators at the time explicitly ruled out human involvement in the deaths. There were no signs of a struggle, no tracks from other people, no evidence of weapons or assault. The Mansi themselves considered the mountain a sacred place, a place of the dead, and avoided it. They had names for it that spoke of danger and spirits, passed down through generations. Whether this represented ancestral knowledge of real hazards, unstable terrain, unusual weather patterns, dangerous wildlife, or something else entirely, remains an open question. The presence of radioactive contamination has led some to wonder about exposure to materials from Soviet nuclear activities. The area, though remote, was not impossibly far from facilities where nuclear research and weapons development occurred. Could the hikers have been exposed to contamination before their trip, or could they have encountered something on the mountain itself? The patterns of contamination weren't consistent across all the bodies or all pieces of clothing, which suggests localized exposure rather than general environmental contamination. Some pieces of clothing showed readings, others did not. If they had encountered a crashed or damaged device containing radioactive materials, it might explain both the contamination and the panic, but no such device was ever found, and no reports of missing materials have come to light. Then there are the more unusual theories, the ones that venture into territory most investigators refuse to consider. The strange lights, the inexplicable injuries, the radiation, the apparent panic. Could these be signs of an encounter with something not of this world? The idea that the Dyatlov group witnessed or was attacked by something extraterrestrial or interdimensional has been proposed by those who find conventional explanations insufficient. The missing eyes and tongue, removed with what seemed like precision, rather than torn by scavengers, have been cited as evidence of something beyond natural predation. The lack of external wounds, despite massive internal trauma, suggests technology or force beyond what could be produced by avalanche, animal, or human attacker. These theories remain speculative, built on the gaps in our understanding, rather than direct evidence, yet they persist because those gaps are so large, so troubling. What makes the Dyatlov Pass incident so compelling, so resistant to closure, is the combination of documented facts that refuse to form a coherent picture. We know these people existed. We know they died. We have photographs they took showing them setting up camp, smiling and relaxed just hours before whatever happened occurred. We have the physical evidence, the tent, the bodies, the clothing, the autopsy reports. We have witness statements about lights in the sky. We have radiation readings and injury descriptions from official Soviet documents. These are not rumors or folklore. They are facts. And yet they don't add up to an explanation that satisfies all the evidence. Some researchers have suggested that multiple factors combined. That perhaps the hikers were driven from their tent by one threat, an infrasound event, or the approach of something they feared, and then encountered a second danger that caused the traumatic injuries. This layered explanation accounts for the different types of evidence, but requires accepting that this group experienced an extraordinarily unlikely series of misfortunes. Others believe the answer is simpler, that we're missing one key piece of information that would make everything clear, some detail that was lost or deliberately omitted from the investigation. The families of the victims spent decades seeking answers, pushing for reinvestigations, refusing to accept the vague conclusions offered by authorities. In 2019, 60 years after the incident, Russian authorities reopened the case. Their conclusion, announced in 2020, favored the avalanche theory. Yet even this modern investigation acknowledged puzzling aspects of the case that don't fit neatly into any single explanation. The lack of avalanche debris, the specific pattern of injuries, the cut tent. These elements continue to resist simple categorization. What happened on the slopes of Dead Mountain remains, in many ways, unknowable. 9 people fled their shelter in the middle of a frozen night, choosing almost certain death over remaining where they were. Some force, some threat, real or perceived, drove them into conditions that would kill them within hours, if not minutes. 4 of them sustained injuries so severe that hypothermia wasn't even the cause of death. Injuries that seemed to come from massive force applied without external wounds. Something occurred on that mountain that we still cannot fully explain, something that transformed a routine expedition into a nightmare that has echoed through decades. The theories continue to evolve, shaped by new technologies, new understanding of natural phenomena, new information that occasionally emerges from old Soviet files. Each explanation illuminates part of the mystery while leaving other parts in shadow. Perhaps that's why the Dyatlov Pass incident endures in our collective imagination, why it continues to generate discussion and debate. It sits at the intersection of the known and the unknown, a documented event that defies documentation, a tragedy with facts, but no satisfactory narrative to connect them. The mountain keeps its secrets, and the 9 who died, they're left behind more questions than answers, more mystery than resolution.